The bank was crowded by mid-afternoon. Every eye in the lobby had shifted toward the man in the wrinkled shirt and worn shoes, the way people look when a room has already made its judgment. He stepped up to the counter and said one simple thing. "I just need to withdraw $50. The woman behind him laughed. She didn't even try to hide it. $50, she repeated, her voice filled with contempt. Then the teller glanced at her screen, and her expression suddenly went still. No one in that room was prepared for what happened next. Stay until the end. The truth behind his account will change everything you think you know about success. The smile spread slowly, the way contempt often does when someone makes no effort to conceal it. Scarlet's eyes moved from Nathaniel's back to his shoes, then to Lily, and finally back toward the teller window. Her expression changed from mild amusement to something much sharper. It was the look of a woman who had decided that the situation in front of her was beneath the standard she normally tolerated. "You waited this long," she said, her voice loud enough for the nearby people to hear without becoming a shout. "For $50. Nathaniel didn't turn around. He kept his eyes forward, his hands resting flat on the counter, his posture unchanged. Only his fingers moved as they gently tightened around Lily's hand. Scarlet allowed the silence to linger for a moment before pushing further. "There's an ATM outside. You know that, right? Right by the entrance. You didn't have to stand in line for 20 minutes. A man 2 places behind them laughed under his breath. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to show that he had heard her and agreed with her point. A woman in a yellow blouse exchanged a glance with the person beside her, the silent language of strangers who had decided they were on the same side. The teller behind the counter was named Jessica. She had worked at the branch for 3 years and now stared at her screen with the focused expression of someone pretending not to hear. Lily tugged gently on her father's hand. "Dad," she whispered, barely loud enough for him to hear, "did we do something wrong?" The question settled over the room quietly, but it carried far more weight than anyone expected. A few people who had been smirking stopped. One woman near the door looked away. The man who had laughed suddenly became very interested in his phone. Nathaniel crouched down to Lily's level. He looked directly at her, the way he always did when she asked something that deserved an honest answer. He slowly shook his head. "No, sweetheart," he said, "we didn't do anything wrong." He stood again without rushing. Scarlet watched the exchange with the mild curiosity of someone observing a minor inconvenience. She tilted her head. Something about the way he had spoken to the child, the calmness in his voice, and the complete absence of embarrassment, briefly confused her. His response wasn't what she had expected. "You know," she said, lowering her voice slightly. Not quieter, but more deliberate, like someone making sure every word was understood. "People like him really shouldn't waste everyone's time in here." She wasn't speaking directly to anyone. She said it the way people sometimes make comments they want others to hear without being held responsible for them. The words drifted across the lobby. Jessica typed something on her keyboard. Her jaw tightened, and her expression became professionally blank, the way someone looks when they have heard comments like this before but never found a response that wouldn't make things worse. Nathaniel said nothing. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his bank card. It was plain black with no visible branding, the kind of card that carried no obvious status signal. He placed it on the counter. "Whenever you're ready," he said to Jessica. Jessica picked up the card and swiped it through the reader with the practiced ease of someone who had performed the motion thousands of times. She entered the account number. Her eyes moved to the screen. Then she stopped. It wasn't a dramatic pause. It lasted barely a second, but from the counter, anyone watching closely could see that Jessica suddenly froze. Her hand hovered above the keyboard. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen. She blinked and looked again. Then she leaned forward slightly, reading whatever had appeared in front of her. She leaned back. "Sir," she said, and there was something different in her voice now. It was careful and precise, as though she suddenly realized that her next words had to be chosen very carefully. "Are you sure you want to withdraw only $50? Nathaniel looked at her. "That's all I need." "Of course." Jessica nodded. "I just want to make sure." She entered something else, then stopped once more. Her eyes shifted toward the manager's office, a glass-walled room at the far corner of the floor, where a man in a gray suit sat behind a desk reviewing paperwork. Scarlett's patience had been wearing thin since she walked through the door. She had meetings at 4:30 and a call at 5, and the line at this branch on Tuesdays always seemed longer than it should have been. "Seriously," she muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "what is taking so long?" Several people shifted uncomfortably in line. Someone checked their phone. The normal impatience of a crowded lobby hung in the air, warm and familiar, completely unaware that everything was about to shift. Lily leaned against her father's leg and watched Jessica with the steady, innocent attention only children can give without realizing it might seem impolite. The stuffed rabbit hung from her arm, its one good ear flopping to the side. Jessica typed another line. She took a breath. Then, very quietly, she picked up the small handset on her desk and made a call. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. No one in the lobby could hear what was said on the other end. Jessica listened, nodded once, and carefully placed the handset back down. Then she looked at Nathaniel. The careful blankness in her expression was gone. It had been replaced by something that could only be described as composed respect, not submissive, not overly eager, simply the quiet attentiveness of someone who suddenly understood exactly who she was speaking with. "One moment, sir. My manager is coming over." Nathaniel nodded. "Take your time." Scarlett made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Of course, there's a manager involved," she said, "for $50. The man in the gray suit was David Holt, the branch manager for 11 years. He was an experienced reader of situations, someone who had handled everything from heated customer disputes to federal auditors with the same measured calm. He stepped out of his office and walked across the floor. He moved at the steady pace of someone who had learned never to hurry in a way that attracted attention. He reached the teller station, leaned slightly toward the screen and read. His expression didn't change. It wasn't the look of a man caught off guard. It was the expression of someone who had received important information and was carefully deciding how to respond. He exchanged a glance with Jessica. She gave the slightest nod. David straightened and turned toward the counter. Around him, the lobby continued as usual. Keyboards clicked, a phone rang somewhere near the far end of the floor, and two people near the entrance spoke quietly. But something had changed. It was barely noticeable if you weren't paying attention, but anyone watching closely could feel it. The center of the room had suddenly shifted without anyone saying a word. Scarlett had been watching the entire time. She folded her arms. "Is there a problem?" she asked. David Holt didn't look at her. He looked directly at Nathaniel. "Mr. Brooks," David said, his voice calm and unhurried, "would you prefer this transaction to be processed from your primary checking account or from one of your investment accounts?" The room didn't become silent all at once. The conversation near the entrance faded first. Then the man holding the phone looked up. The woman in the yellow blazer stopped mid-sentence and turned. Within 4 seconds, the background noise of the lobby had nearly disappeared. The only sound left was the faint hum of the ventilation system overhead. Scarlett slowly uncrossed her arms. Someone behind her whispered, "Wait, what?" Nathaniel's expression didn't change. He didn't look around the room. He didn't seem concerned, or perhaps simply didn't care, that every person in the lobby was now staring at the back of his slightly wrinkled white shirt. "Primary is fine," he said. Jessica's hands returned to the keyboard. They weren't quite as steady as before. "Of course," David said. "We'll handle that right away." He turned back toward the teller station and quietly said something that only Jessica could hear. She typed. The transaction went through. The receipt printed. The moment moved forward, as moments always do, whether everyone is prepared for them or not. But the room itself hadn't recovered. Scarlet Vaughn had built a company from a two-person office in Brooklyn into a $40 million portfolio fund in less than a decade. She had sat across from major investors and negotiated without hesitation. Her reputation had been built on reading a room and understanding its dynamics before anyone else could. Now she stood completely still. Her handbag hung from her wrist. Her jaw was slightly tense. Her eyes remained fixed on the back of the man in the wrinkled shirt, but the amusement was gone. A man too rose behind her, leaned toward the woman beside him, and whispered something. She slowly shook her head. The man who had laughed earlier was staring at the floor. Nobody in the lobby was checking their phone anymore. Investment accounts. Plural. The words seemed to settle over the room, sending quiet ripples through everyone who had heard them. What Scarlet Vaughn didn't know, and what no one else in that lobby knew, was that Nathaniel Brooks had spent nearly 6 years making sure almost nobody would. The man in the scuffed shoes had once sat in rooms very much like the one Scarlet occupied. 12 years earlier, Nathaniel had been a financial engineer at a mid-sized quantitative trading firm in Lower Manhattan. He was not famous. He had never appeared on magazine covers or been invited to speak at industry conferences. But he had been very, very good, the kind of good other analysts noticed and sometimes resented. The kind of skill that turns ordinary work into something that quietly outperforms the market by a margin that cannot be explained by luck alone. He built models. He spotted patterns in structured financial instruments that his colleagues had dismissed as noise, and he was patient enough to wait until those patterns confirmed themselves instead of acting too early. He presented his findings in a way that made complicated ideas understandable without oversimplifying them. For 3 years, the people with the authority to act on his recommendations had consistently followed them. Then he left the firm and built something of his own. The startup he founded, a small quantitative investment technology company that created pricing tools for mid-market fund managers, had been operating for 4 years when it started attracting serious attention from outside investors. 2 early employees held minority stakes. His business partner, Derek, had known Nathaniel since graduate school. Nathaniel trusted him in the way you trust someone who has faced difficult times beside you. Derek owned 30%. The betrayal, when it happened, was technical rather than dramatic. Over roughly 4 months, Derek approached a strategic buyer without Nathaniel's knowledge. He created a preliminary agreement that would have effectively transferred operational control without activating the protective buyout clauses Nathaniel had included in their original partnership agreement. It was the kind of move that required patience, access, and the cold calculation of knowing exactly which parts of someone's trust could be quietly bypassed. By the time Nathaniel discovered what was happening, the damage could still be contained, but stopping it cost him the company. He settled. He walked away with his core intellectual property, his professional reputation mostly intact, and a settlement based on what the business had been worth at its last formal valuation rather than what it might have become. He was 32 years old and starting over. He was also becoming a father. Lily had been born 6 months before the company collapsed, so the first 6 months of her life had been loud, joyful, and full of change. The following 18 months were different. The 2 years after that demanded a level of discipline Nathaniel had never realized he possessed. His ex-wife left during the restructuring. He didn't blame her, at least not in the simple way people often assign blame after a divorce. She had committed to one version of their life and suddenly found herself living another without ever having chosen it. He understood that. He understood it the way you understand something that still hurts, even when you can clearly see why it happened. He had Lily every day, except for 3 weekends each month. Those days without her were the quietest he had ever experienced. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that makes everything you would rather ignore seem louder. During the first year, he learned to fill that time with work. In the second year, he realized that staying busy was not the same as being okay. By the third year, he had reached something closer to balance, a life that genuinely belonged to him, built deliberately around the things that actually mattered. He had rebuilt quietly, without announcements. The settlement money went into a diversified structure. Index funds for the foundation, a small private fund he informally managed for former colleagues who still trusted his judgment, and direct equity positions in 3 companies. He studied those investments with the same methodical care he had once applied to structured instruments. He lived simply, not because he had to, but because he chose to. Somewhere in the middle of rebuilding, Nathaniel decided that the kind of success that required constant visible proof was not the kind he wanted for himself or his daughter. He wore his usual shirt because it was comfortable and clean. He drove a 7-year-old sedan because it was reliable, and the payments had been finished years ago. He took Lily to the bank on Tuesdays because she liked watching people and asking questions about them. More importantly, the trip gave them something ordinary to share during the quiet afternoon hours before dinner. The $50 was for ice cream. The receipt came out of the printer. Jessica folded it carefully and handed it across the counter with both hands, a gesture she hadn't made for a routine withdrawal in her 3 years at the branch. Scarlet hadn't moved. She was staring at Nathaniel's profile, the clean line of his jaw, the calm way he folded the receipt and slipped it into his breast pocket. Over the past few minutes, her expression had shifted from contempt to confusion, and then toward something she still couldn't quite name. She couldn't help herself. "What do you do?" she asked. The question came out more directly than she intended. She was used to controlling the tone of her voice and the weight behind her words. In 12 years of running a company, she had learned how to ask questions that sounded casual but carried meaning. This one came out plain and slightly vulnerable, the way questions sometimes do when they come from genuine surprise. Nathaniel took Lily's hand. He turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge that he had heard her. He didn't answer. David Holt was still standing nearby with the neutral expression of someone who knew exactly what was happening and had no intention of making the situation worse. He cleared his throat quietly. "Mr. Brooks is one of our highest value clients," he said. He delivered it simply, without exaggeration or unnecessary emphasis, like a fact that needed no explanation. The lobby absorbed the words. The man who had laughed under his breath was now staring at the floor. The woman in the yellow blazer had turned completely away. The person who had whispered, "Wait," wasn't saying anything anymore. Lily looked up at her father with the clear, direct expression of a 6-year-old, who had sensed the mood of the room, without understanding why it had changed. "Dad," she said, "why didn't you tell them?" Nathaniel looked down at her. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something close to it. "Tell them what, Bug?" "That you have all the money." He crouched down, bringing himself to her level in the calm way he always did when she asked something that deserved a proper answer. The lobby seemed to wait. "Because we don't need to prove anything," he said. "Not to anyone, you understand." Lily thought about it with the seriousness children sometimes give to lessons they know they'll remember. Then she nodded once. "Okay," she said. "Can we get ice cream now?" "Almost," he replied, standing up. Scarlet Vaughn had built her career around constant forward movement. Every obstacle she encountered, she pushed through faster, with more precision and better information than whoever stood in her way. She had never been particularly good at stopping. She had never needed to be. But now she was stopped. She stood 3 feet from the counter, designer handbag hanging from her wrist, heels planted against the marble floor, and had absolutely nothing to say that wouldn't make the situation worse. She knew it too. The discomfort was almost physical, the uncomfortable realization of having been publicly wrong. After a moment, she tried anyway. "I didn't mean to," she began. Nathaniel turned. For the first time since she had spoken to him, he faced her completely. He wasn't angry. He wasn't smug. He looked like a man who had experienced this kind of conversation in different forms many times before. Someone who had thought carefully about what he believed and had reached a position that didn't require him to put on a show. "You meant exactly what you said," he told her. His words were quiet, not cold, just direct, the kind of directness that left little room for excuses. Scarlet opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "You didn't laugh at my money," Nathaniel continued, his voice steady and without anger. "You laughed at who you thought I was." He let the words settle for a moment, just as she had allowed her earlier comments to hang in the air. But his words landed differently because they were true. And everyone in the room knew it. "That's the part worth thinking about," he said. Then he turned back toward the counter, thanked Jessica by name, and picked up Lily's stuffed rabbit from the edge of the counter. Lily was examining a potted plant near the window. "Lily, let's go." She grabbed her rabbit and stepped beside him, her small hand finding his again without even looking. Together they walked toward the door. Scarlet watched them pass. The lobby slowly returned to normal. Keyboards clicked, a phone rang, and the line moved forward. The ordinary rhythm of a busy bank continued as though the last several minutes had never happened. But Scarlet remained where she stood. David Holt didn't follow Nathaniel to the entrance. He wasn't the kind of manager who made a public display of escorting important clients through a crowded lobby. But he did move toward the edge of the counter and watched through the glass as Nathaniel and Lily crossed the entrance and stepped outside into the October afternoon. He was still watching when Scarlet approached the counter. She placed her own card down with less care than usual, a small, involuntary sign that she was unsettled. Jessica took it without comment. David stepped closer to the window. He waited until Jessica started the transaction before speaking. "I don't know if this is relevant to you," he said carefully, keeping his voice low enough for Scarlet alone to hear. "But Mr. Brooks holds a significant equity position in Vaughn Capital Group. He's been a passive investor since your Series B." Scarlet froze. Her Series B had closed 4 years earlier. It was the round that allowed her to expand the company, the one that transformed Vaughn Capital from a respected boutique operation into a firm with real market presence. She knew the names of every investor who had participated. She had met them, shaken their hands, attended closing dinners, and personally followed up with nearly everyone who had invested. She had never met anyone named Nathaniel Brooks. "He invested through a holding company," David explained, reading the question on her face. "The name on the cap table is Brooks Linden Capital Partners." Scarlet knew that name. Brooks Linden had entered quietly through a third-party introduction 2 weeks before the round officially closed. Her attorneys had reviewed the structure. Her CFO had approved the terms. The capital had arrived securely and on schedule. She had treated it as a routine professional transaction and moved on. She had never bothered to put a face to the name behind it. She had stood in a bank line and laughed at him for wanting $50. David excused himself with a nod and returned to his office. The glass door closed behind him with a quiet click. Scarlet remained at the counter for a moment after her transaction was completed. The receipt rested on the surface in front of her. She didn't pick it up immediately. She was thinking about the man in the wrinkled shirt who had crouched down in the middle of a crowded lobby, looked his daughter directly in the eyes, and calmly told her they had done nothing wrong without once looking around to see who was watching. Outside, the afternoon was clear, the kind of October day the city occasionally produces to make up for everything else. It was cool enough for jackets and bright enough to send long, warm beams of light between the buildings. The kind of afternoon that makes people walk a little slower than necessary. Nathaniel stopped on the sidewalk and looked down at Lily. "Okay," he said. He opened his wallet and held up the $50 bill. It was new and flat, just like the bills that came from teller drawers. "What flavor?" Lily considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Strawberry," she said, "and maybe chocolate after." "That's 2 flavors. You asked what flavor." "That's fair," he said. They continued walking. Lily carried the rabbit in her outside arm and held her father's hand with the other. Her sneakers tapped against the pavement in the short, quick rhythm of someone whose legs weren't quite long enough for the stride she was trying to keep. Nathaniel matched her pace without even thinking about it. It was the way people naturally match the rhythm of someone they love, without realizing they're doing it. He didn't look back at the bank. He wasn't angry, or rather, he had been angry somewhere in the middle of it. It was the kind of anger that comes when something confirms what you already know about the way the world can treat people, making assumptions and placing them into categories before knowing anything about them. But anger had never been something Nathaniel held onto for long. It came, he felt it, and then it passed because there were better things to do with the space it occupied. He had learned that years earlier in rooms far more important than a bank lobby, and the lesson had stayed with him. As they walked, he thought about Lily's question. "Why didn't you tell them?" He turned it over in his mind, the way he considered most things that came from her, with genuine curiosity. Her questions had a way of reducing complicated issues to their simplest form, which meant answering them honestly often required more thought than expected. The truth was simple. He hadn't told them because there was nothing to explain. He wasn't there to correct anyone's assumptions, change the mood of the room, or prove that the money in his account said anything about his value. He was there because his daughter liked watching people, and getting $50 for ice cream meant making a trip to the bank and standing in line. That was enough. It had always been enough. He bought her strawberry ice cream first. Lily ate it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had made her choice and was completely happy with it. They sat together on a bench outside the shop in the afternoon light. Lily told him about something that had happened at school, involving a turtle and a misunderstanding over whose backpack it had been placed in. Nathaniel listened to every word. The email from Vaughn Capital Group arrived in Nathaniel's inbox on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the bank. It came from Scarlet Vaughn's personal email address, not her assistant's. The subject line was simple. "I owe you an apology," read it twice. It was direct and without unnecessary decoration, an acknowledgement of what had happened, a clear statement of what she regretted, and a line near the end saying she had been thinking about it for almost 2 weeks and had decided the apology was owed whether he responded or not. She also mentioned in the second-to-last paragraph that Vaughn Capital was preparing for a major expansion, including a raise that could take the firm to another level. She said she would completely understand if he chose not to participate, but she wanted him to have the information first. Not because of the money, because she had been thinking about who she wanted at the table going forward and why. And the answer had surprised her. Nathaniel thought about the email for 2 days. He thought about it while preparing Lily's lunch, reviewing his other investments, and sitting with a cup of coffee on Sunday morning as he watched the city move at its own relaxed weekend pace. He thought about the woman in the crimson dress who had seen him as insignificant, only to discover within 4 minutes that she had been using the wrong measure. He thought about what it cost someone to write an email like the one she had sent. Not the financial cost. The other kind. The kind that requires sitting with your own reflection long enough to recognize something you would rather have ignored. On Tuesday, he wrote back. He declined the investment without being harsh or offering a long explanation. It was the kind of straightforward refusal that respected both sides because it didn't demand a justification. He kept his existing position because the fundamentals were strong and because his investment decisions had never been personal. But he added one line at the end. For what it's worth, the question your daughter might ask you someday is the same one mine asked me. Whether you teach her that value is visible or that it isn't, that's the only decision that matters in the long run. He sent it Tuesday morning. Before taking Lily to school, before the ordinary day took over again and filled the spaces where bigger thoughts had briefly existed, he drove her in the 7-year-old car with the radio playing softly. She sang along to something she had learned in music class, slightly off-key and completely unconcerned about it. He drove. Respect is the only currency that never loses its value. Not because it buys anything, but because it reveals what a person truly believes about others, the value they place on people, and how they act on that belief when no one is checking the balance. When the shoes are worn, the shirt is no longer pressed, and the only visible evidence of a person is the surface they present to a lobby full of strangers who have already decided what they see. Respect still matters. Scarlet Vaughn changed the way she ran her company in the months that followed. Not dramatically. Not overnight. She began noticing who she overlooked in meetings and asking herself why. She asked different questions when she was introduced to people. She stopped judging people at a glance. Her direct reports, who had always considered her sharp and effective, began noticing something different in her behavior. At first, they couldn't quite put it into words. Then one of them, her youngest analyst, described it during a team meeting without realizing how accurately she had captured the change. She started listening before deciding. None of them knew what had caused the shift. Scarlet never told them. Some lessons aren't meant to be explained in a company-wide meeting. Some lessons are carried quietly, especially the ones that cost something to learn. And for Scarlet, it had become that simple.